When we think of ancient Greece, our minds often drift to grand philosophers debating under marble columns, heroic warriors clashing on battlefields, or the birth of democracy, a civilization celebrated as the cradle of Western thought. But beneath the polished surface of this golden age lies a shadowy underbelly, a side of history rarely whispered in textbooks. What if I told you that behind the poetry and philosophy there were rituals so brutal, secrets so dark, they'd make even the most hardened historian shudder? This is the untold story of ancient Greece, a world where beauty and brutality existed side by side, where the lines between myth and reality blurred in the most unsettling ways. Picture this: newborns deemed imperfect were left to die on remote hillsides, a chilling practice sanctioned by the state. Political rivals weren't just debated, they were poisoned, exiled, or stabbed in the back, quite literally. And then there were the cults operating in the dead of night, their initiation rites so terrifying they were forbidden from speaking of them under penalty of death. These aren't scenes from a horror story, they were everyday realities in the cities we now romanticize as bastions of enlightenment. So why don't we hear about these darker chapters? Because history, as they say, is written by the victors, and the victors preferred to polish their legacy, leaving the stains to fade into obscurity. But today we're pulling back the veil. Over the next 25 revelations, we'll journey into the heart of ancient Greece's darkest secrets, from the sanctioned cruelty of Spartan society to the twisted games of power in Athenian politics. You'll discover how love could be a death sentence, how gods demanded unthinkable sacrifices, and how even the greatest minds of the age were entangled in scandals that would shock the modern world. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a reckoning with the truth. So brace yourself, because the Greece you're about to meet is far more complex, far more human, and far more terrifying than you ever imagined. In the glittering city-states of ancient Greece, where democracy and philosophy flourished, a far grimmer reality lurked beneath the surface, one that modern minds might struggle to reconcile with their enlightened ideals. Among the most haunting practices was the widespread acceptance of infanticide, particularly targeting newborns deemed unfit for society. Whether they were girls seen as burdensome in a male-dominated world or infants with physical imperfections, these children were often abandoned on lonely hillsides or tossed into pits, left to succumb to the elements. The term for this practice, exposure, sounds almost clinical, as if it could soften the brutality of leaving a helpless baby to die. Athens and Sparta, though rivals in so many ways, shared this dark tradition. In Sparta, it was state-mandated newborns were inspected by elders, and if they showed any sign of weakness, they were discarded without a second thought. The goal, to cultivate a society of unmatched warriors where only the strongest survived. But Athens, the so-called cradle of democracy, was no better. Families facing economic hardship or those simply unwilling to raise a daughter, who would require a dowry, often made the same chilling choice. Archaeologists have uncovered grim evidence of this practice, from the baby wells of Athens filled with tiny bones to mass graves in the outskirts of Greek settlements. What's even more unsettling, many of these infants weren't just left to die, some were buried in pottery shards, a silent admission that their fate was no accident, but a deliberate act approved by society. Even great thinkers like Plato and Aristotle defended the practice, arguing it was necessary to maintain the ideal population. This wasn't just the act of desperate individuals, it was woven into the fabric of Greek life, justified by philosophy, enforced by tradition, and hidden in plain sight behind their marble monuments. The next time you admire the grandeur of the Acropolis, remember, its foundations might be built on secrets far darker than stone. If you thought modern military training was tough, the Spartan agoge would have been your worst nightmare, a childhood deliberately stripped of comfort, warmth, or mercy. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were torn from their families and thrust into a state-run boot camp designed to break them down, then rebuild them as unfeeling killing machines. This wasn't just training, it was a relentless gauntlet where survival wasn't guaranteed. Hunger was a weapon. Boys were given such meager rations that stealing food wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. But get caught and the punishment was brutal, not for taking the food but for failing to do it stealthily. They'd be whipped raw for their clumsiness, taught that cunning mattered as much as strength. Some didn't survive these lessons, others carried the scars for life, both physical and psychological. Then there were the games, if you could call them that. One ritual, the diamastagosis, involved boys being flogged bloody in front of an altar, competing to endure the most pain without crying out. Some collapsed from exhaustion. A few even died, their deaths celebrated as proof of their commitment to Sparta. This was no coming-of-age ceremony. It was a systematic erasure of weakness, where empathy was beaten out of them before they could even grasp what it meant. And the cruelty had a purpose. Sparta's entire society revolved around producing the perfect warrior, a soldier so hardened he could march into battle without hesitation, without fear. By the time these boys reached adulthood, they weren't just soldiers, they were weapons, honed by years of calculated suffering. The agoge didn't just train Spartans. It manufactured legends, but at a cost that would be unthinkable today. The next time you hear someone romanticize Spartan discipline, remember, behind every famed warrior was a childhood stolen by the state, replaced with pain and perfected violence. The Olympics we know today, with their medals, world records, and spirit of sportsmanship, are a far cry from their ancient origins. In fact, the original games featured an event so brutal, so shockingly violent, that it makes modern mixed martial arts look tame by comparison. This was pancration, a no-rules blood sport where the only forbidden moves were biting and gouging eyes. Everything else, from broken bones to strangulation, was fair game. Imagine stepping into the arena barehanded against an opponent trained to snap limbs like twigs. There were no weight classes, no time limits, and no referees to step in if things went too far. Fighters aimed not just to win, but to force their rival to submit, often by bending joints backward until ligaments tore or putting them in chokeholds until they passed out. Some matches ended in death, with corpses dragged from the stadium as the crowd cheered. One infamous fighter, a Hessian, won the event posthumously. His opponent tapped out, but not before a Hessian's neck had already been broken mid-chokehold. But pancration wasn't the only deadly spectacle. Chariot racing, another Olympic staple, turned the track into a death trap. With no barriers separating the speeding horses, collisions were catastrophic. Drivers were trampled, chariots flipped, and bodies were torn apart under wheels, all for the fleeting glory of an olive wreath. Even boxing lacked the protective gear of today's matches. Fighters wrapped their hands in leather straps studded with metal, turning punches into bone-shattering blows. One champion, Cleomes, was disqualified after beating his opponent to death, only to be later worshipped as a hero because in ancient Greece, victory, no matter how bloody, was sacred. This was entertainment at its most primal, where the line between athlete and gladiator blurred. The crowds didn't just watch, they reveled in the brutality, celebrating wounds as proof of a competitor's devotion to the gods. Behind the olive branches and poetic odes, the Olympics were a theater of violence where glory wasn't earned. It was taken, often at the cost of another's life. Among the most disturbing contradictions of ancient Greece was the practice of sacred prostitution, where worship and exploitation intertwined under the guise of divine devotion. In cities like Corinth, the temple of Aphrodite wasn't just a place of prayer. It was a sprawling enterprise where thousands of enslaved women and girls were forced into ritualized sex work, all in the name of religion. These so-called sacred prostitutes, known as hieroduli, were anything but willing participants. Many were prisoners of war, sold into slavery, or impoverished locals with no other means of survival. The temple's wealth grew from their suffering. Sailors and merchants visiting Corinth's bustling ports would climb the Acrocorinth to the temple, not just to pray, but to pay for intimacy as an offering to Aphrodite. The line between worship and vice was deliberately blurred. A night with a temple prostitute was spun as a spiritual act, a way to honor the goddess of love. But in reality, it was a brutal system of control. These women had no autonomy over their bodies or lives. While free citizens celebrated festivals and recited hymns to Aphrodite's beauty, her so-called priestesses endured lifetimes of violence masked as piety. Even more chilling, this wasn't unique to Corinth. Temples across the Greek world, from Sicily to Asia Minor, operated similarly, amassing fortunes through the bodies of the vulnerable. Philosophers like Strabo wrote matter-of-factly about the scale of these operations, as if describing trade goods rather than human beings. The goddess's mythology only deepened the exploitation. Stories of Aphrodite's promiscuity were used to justify the system, framing sexual subjugation as divine will. What makes this practice especially jarring is how it was sanitized by history. Ancient texts gloss over the suffering, focusing instead on the temple's grandeur or the goddess's allure. But archaeology tells a different story. Cramped quarters hidden behind ornate altars, skeletal remains showing signs of malnutrition and injury, and inscriptions listing women as property, not people. The next time you hear about Greece's sacred sites, remember, their splendor was often built on the backs of those with no escape, their voices erased by the very gods they were forced to serve. Poison wasn't just a weapon in ancient Greece, it was political theater, a silent killer that could topple kings and rewrite history without a drop of blood spilled in public. Hemlock, a deceptively delicate plant, became the preferred tool of assassins and power brokers, its use so widespread that entire factions specialized in its deadly administration. Take the baffling demise of Philip II of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father. One moment he stood at the pinnacle of power, having united Greece under his rule. The next he collapsed at his daughter's wedding feast, felled by a dagger, or so the official story claimed. But whispers persisted for centuries. Was it really the dagger wound that killed him, or had someone slipped poison into his cup hours earlier, ensuring his death would be slow, agonizing, and utterly deniable? The art of political poisoning thrived in Athens, where democracy didn't stop the elite from settling scores with a well-timed draft. Even Socrates, the philosopher who drank hemlock willingly as his state ordered execution, became a cautionary tale, less about justice, more about sending a message to dissidents. But unlike Socrates, most victims never saw it coming. Rivals would share wine at symposia, unaware their host had laced it with aconite, a toxin so vicious it caused paralysis while leaving the victim fully conscious. Others fell to moly, a mythical herb rumored to disguise poisons as medicine, turning routine treatments into death sentences. What made poison so insidious was its ambiguity. Without forensic science, deaths could be blamed on bad humors, divine wrath, or simple misfortune. When the Spartan general Lysander dropped dead in 395 BC, his allies cried murder, pointing fingers at Theban conspirators. Yet with no proof, the crime faded into legend, a shadow war where accusations were as lethal as the poisons themselves. Even antidotes became weapons. Doctors peddling fake cures could finish what the initial dose started, covering their tracks with a show of medical concern. This was power played in whispers, where the safest bet was to trust no one, not your cupbearer, not your physician, not even your own family. The next time you admire Greek political ingenuity, remember, their greatest innovations weren't just in governance, but in the dark arts of making enemies disappear. Beneath the gleaming marble of Athens and the disciplined order of Sparta, an invisible class toiled in unimaginable misery, the slaves who formed the backbone of Greek civilization. Modern portrayals often soften the reality, suggesting slavery in ancient Greece was a benign institution, even comparing household servants to part of the family. But the truth, for every slave who poured wine at a symposium, hundreds more endured lives so brutal they'd make a galley rower weep. Take the silver mines of Laurion just south of Athens. These tunnels were the city's economic engine, financing its navy and democracy, but they ran on human suffering. Slaves, often prisoners of war or children sold by desperate parents, were chained in darkness, hacking at rock with primitive tools. There were no shifts, no rest. Workers inhaled toxic dust until their lungs failed. Their skeletal remains later found in collapsed tunnels, still crouched as if digging. The historian Xenophon praised Laurion's profits but ignored the cost. A slave's average lifespan underground was less than 3 years. Household slaves fared only slightly better. Branding was common, hot iron searing ownership marks into flesh as if they were livestock. Runaways faced public mutilation, noses slit, tendons severed, to deter others. Even a master's whims could turn deadly. One account tells of a wealthy Athenian who punished a slave for breaking a glass by throwing him into a furnace, a crime that went unpunished because under Greek law, slaves weren't people. They were property, as disposable as a cracked amphora. The most chilling part, this cruelty was systematized. Aristotle argued slavery was natural, claiming some were born to serve, while philosophers like Plato casually listed whipping as standard discipline. Free citizens strolled past slave markets where children were displayed like fruit, their prices scratched onto pottery shards. The Parthenon's splendor, the agora's debates, even the triremes that won wars all depended on this hidden underclass. So next time you admire Greek achievements, ask yourself, how many silent, nameless souls paid for that glory with their lives? If the Spartans perfected the art of disciplined brutality, the followers of Dionysus embraced chaos in its purest form, a religious frenzy so extreme it left bones scattered across mountainsides. The god of wine and ecstasy demanded worship that defied all reason, drawing devotees into nights of intoxication, dancing, and ultimately bloodshed. These weren't quiet prayers in candlelit temples. They were ravenous rituals where participants, high on potent brews and the belief they channeled the god himself, descended into a madness known as sparagmos, the act of tearing living creatures apart with their bare hands. Goats were the most common victims, their limbs wrenched from sockets as the cultists screamed in divine delirium. But some ancient sources hint at something darker. Plutarch describes rites where worshippers, possessed by the god spirit, mistook human bystanders for beasts, reducing them to mangled flesh in the moonlight. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or not, the terror was real enough that Greek authorities banned the cult's wildest ceremonies, fearing they'd unravel society itself. The madness didn't stop at Greece's borders. When the Romans adopted Dionysus as Bacchus, his rituals spiraled into the infamous Bacchanalia scandals of 186 BC. Senate investigations uncovered orgies laced with poisoned wine, falsified prophecies used to blackmail elites, and rumors of initiates being buried alive in sacrificial pits. The Roman state cracked down, executing thousands in what became one of history's earliest moral panics. But the cult survived underground, a shadow of its former self, proof that even the mightiest empire couldn't stamp out humanity's hunger for ecstasy, or its capacity for savagery in the name of the divine. What makes these rituals so unsettling isn't just the violence, but the way they twisted spirituality into something feral. Dionysus wasn't a distant deity to be appeased with orderly offerings. He was a force of nature, a god who demanded his followers shed their humanity to touch the divine. In that moment of frenzy, the line between worshipper and beast vanished, and what remained was a glimpse of the darkest corners of the ancient soul. The myths of ancient Greece are filled with harrowing tales of gods demanding the unthinkable, stories like that of Iphigenia, the young princess sacrificed by her own father Agamemnon to appease Artemis and secure fair winds for Troy. While these narratives were long dismissed as symbolic or exaggerated, chilling archaeological discoveries suggest some rituals might have been more than just legend. At Mount Lycaon, a site sacred to Zeus, excavations uncovered a teenage boy's skeleton buried beneath an altar, his bones scorched by fire and scattered alongside animal remains. This wasn't a typical burial. The positioning hinted at ritualistic violence, and the presence of ceremonial pottery sealed the grim truth. Someone had died here not by accident but as an offering. What makes this find so unsettling is how it mirrors the region's darkest lore. Ancient writers like Pausanias describe the Lycaon rituals as shrouded in secrecy, with whispers of participants consuming human flesh to become wolves in Zeus's honor. Most historians dismissed these accounts as superstition until the bones spoke otherwise. Forensic analysis revealed cut marks consistent with sacrificial practices, while the victim's age matched descriptions of chosen youths in cult texts. Even more damning, the site dates to the same era when Greek literature brimmed with references to human sacrifice, from the Minotaur's Athenian tributes to the mythical king Lycaon, who supposedly butchered a child on Zeus's altar. Yet the line between myth and reality blurs further. While mass sacrifices like Carthage's child burnings left unambiguous evidence, Greek rituals were often subtler, designed to leave room for denial. A single skeleton could be explained away, a whispered tradition dismissed as rumor. That's what makes Mount Lycaon so pivotal. It's a smoking gun in a civilization that prided itself on enlightenment but harbored pockets of primal brutality. The boy's bones force us to ask how many other altars, now crumbling under olive groves, might hold similar secrets. This duality defines ancient Greece's dark side. They gave us democracy and drama, yet in the same breath practiced rites that would horrify even their barbarian neighbors. Perhaps that's the most disturbing truth of all. Their capacity for beauty and savagery weren't contradictions, but two sides of the same coin. The next time you read a Greek myth about gods demanding lives, remember, somewhere in the shadows between poetry and reality, those stories might have been more than metaphors. Deep in the heart of ancient Greece's religious calendar lay the Thesmophoria, a festival celebrated exclusively by women, shrouded in secrecy, and far more macabre than its surface-level fertility rites suggest. For 3 days each autumn, married women abandoned their homes, gathering on hilltops to honor Demeter, goddess of the harvest. Public records describe solemn processions and fasting, but whispered accounts tell of something far stranger. Rotting piglets tossed into underground chambers called megara, left to decay for months before being retrieved and mixed with seeds as blessed fertilizer. What modern scholars often gloss over is the visceral horror of these rituals. The pigs weren't merely sacrificed, they were thrown alive into the pits, their squeals echoing as they starved or suffocated in the darkness. When women later climbed down to retrieve the bloated carcasses, they did so with bare hands, scattering flesh that had fermented into a grotesque slurry across fields. This wasn't just symbolism, it was a tactile confrontation with death and rebirth, where the stench of decay clung to their skin like a prayer. But the festival's darkest layers emerge in fragments of forbidden text. A handful of vase paintings depict women wielding torches and knives in frenzied dances, while playwrights like Aristophanes hint at mock battles where participants drew blood. Some historians argue these were theatrical reenactments of Persephone's abduction, but others point to archaic inscriptions found near the Thesmophoria sites, referencing the Night of Howls and the Rending. Were women channeling primal rage against imagined kidnappers, or did the rituals occasionally tip into real violence? The most chilling clue comes from Sicily, where a variant of the festival called the Stenia involved women hurling insults and beating each other with bark-covered sticks until, as one account claims, the earth was spotted red. Whether this blood was symbolic or real remains debated, but the underlying message is clear. This was no gentle celebration of motherhood. It was a temporary overthrow of the natural order, where women otherwise silenced in Greek society could wield chaos as sacred power. What makes the Thesmophoria so unsettling isn't just its brutality, but its duality. The same hands that tenderly planted seeds had plunged into rotting flesh. The voices that sang hymns by day might have screamed curses by night. In a world where women's lives were tightly controlled, these rites offered a fleeting taste of wildness, a reminder that even the keepers of civilization harbored a darkness that could erupt, if only for 3 days, under the watchful eyes of the gods. High atop the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the Oracle of Delphi sat perched over a crack in the earth, breathing in vapors that twisted her words into divine riddles. Pilgrims from across Greece climbed those sacred steps with gold and desperation, seeking answers about wars, marriages, and fortunes, yet few realized the truth. The Pythia's trances, long attributed to Apollo's divine breath, were likely the result of ethylene gas seeping from the rocks beneath her tripod, a hallucinogenic cocktail that blurred the line between prophecy and poisoning. Modern geologists have found fault lines running directly beneath the temple, leaching traces of methane and ethylene, the same gases used in ancient anesthetic concoctions. Inhaled in enclosed spaces, they induce euphoria, slurred speech, and violent muscle spasms, symptoms eerily matching accounts of the Pythia's frenzied fits. Imagine the scene: a priestess, often an uneducated local girl chosen for her purity, forced into a confined chamber where toxic fumes overwhelmed her senses. As her limbs jerked and her voice deepened, priests would interpret her gibberish into poetic verses, crafting prophecies vague enough to never be wrong. The consequences of these ambiguous words were catastrophic. When King Croesus of Lydia asked if he should attack Persia, the oracle declared he would destroy a great empire. He marched to war, only to realize too late the empire in question was his own. The Athenian statesman Themistocles, seeking guidance against Persian invaders, was told to trust wooden walls. He interpreted this as a call to build a navy, saving Athens, but others who heard similar phrases invested in literal palisades and were slaughtered. Even Alexander the Great, frustrated by the Pythia's refusal to speak to him, dragged her by the hair until she gasped, "You are invincible," a prophecy he then wielded as propaganda. Behind the mystique, the oracle was a weapon of psychological control. Priests curated questions, suppressed inconvenient prophecies, and took bribes to sway interpretations. One nobleman, suspecting foul play, demanded the Pythia answer in writing only to receive a blank tablet. The truth, the oracle's power, came not from the gods, but from humanity's hunger for certainty in an unpredictable world. Yet the darkest twist lies in the Pythia's fate. Ancient sources note few lived past 30, their bodies ravaged by constant exposure to the very gases that made them vessels of the divine. Their voices shaped history, but their lives were as disposable as the goat bones priests scried for omens. The next time you hear someone say, "Know thyself," Delphi's most famous maxim, remember, the temple's real lesson was how easily truth can be warped when people crave answers more than they fear the cost. For nearly 2,000 years, the Eleusinian mysteries remained ancient Greece's best-kept secret, a cult so powerful that even the threat of death couldn't compel its initiates to reveal what transpired in its hallowed halls. Every September, thousands flocked to the small town of Eleusis near Athens, drawn by the promise of experiencing the afterlife while still alive. What awaited them was no ordinary ritual, but a carefully orchestrated descent into the underworld, complete with hallucinogenic potions, psychological terror, and revelations so profound they allegedly erased the fear of death itself. At the heart of the ceremony was the kykeon, a sacred brew scholars now suspect contained ergot, a fungus related to LSD. Drank in the torchlit darkness of the telesterion, a cavernous hall designed to amplify sound and distort perception, the potion hurled participants into visions of Persephone's abduction by Hades. But this wasn't mere storytelling. Ancient accounts describe initiates being led through pitch-black tunnels, where sudden flashes of light revealed actors in monstrous masks, their screams echoing as if from the underworld itself. Some collapsed, convinced they'd crossed the river Styx. Others emerged claiming to have touched eternity. The secrecy surrounding these rites was ironclad. Disclosing the mysteries carried a punishment of execution, a law enforced so ruthlessly that even when the playwright Aeschylus stood trial for allegedly revealing cult secrets onstage, he escaped death only by proving he'd never been initiated. Yet fragments of evidence survive. A 4th century BC vase depicts a trembling initiate crowned with myrtle, his wide eyes reflecting some unseen horror. Later Roman writers, violating their oaths, hinted at a culminating moment where priests brandished a single ear of wheat in silence, a symbol of rebirth so potent that Cicero claimed it gave initiates not only a reason to live but to die with joy. What made the mysteries so transformative wasn't just the spectacle, but the psychology behind it. By simulating death and resurrection, the cult offered something no philosophy could: visceral proof of an afterlife. Skeptics like Hippolytus dismissed it as tricks with mirrors, yet even he admitted its power. Records show slaves and kings alike underwent initiation, their social hierarchies meaningless in the face of the divine. When Christianity finally outlawed the rites in the 4th century, it wasn't because they'd lost relevance, but because they rivaled the new religion's promise of eternal life. The real genius of Eleusis lay in its duality. Behind the terror and theatrics was a message so simple it still resonates: that darkness is always followed by light, that even the deepest despair holds the seed of renewal. The next time you see a field of wheat swaying in the wind, remember, to millions of ancient Greeks, it wasn't just a crop. It was the final, fleeting whisper of a mystery that once reshaped how an entire civilization faced the unknown. While Spartan warriors were celebrated for their battlefield prowess, their most feared weapon wasn't the spear or shield. It was the crypteia, a shadowy brotherhood of young killers who turned night into a slaughterhouse. These weren't soldiers, but teenage boys undergoing the final stage of their agoge training, unleashed upon the helot population like wolves in human form. Their mission: to murder without warning, without mercy, and without consequence. By day, helots toiled in Sparta's fields, their backs bent under the weight of a system that viewed them as subhuman. By night, they huddled in their huts, knowing any sound, a snapped twig, a rusted hinge, might signal the arrival of the crypteia. The boys moved in darkness, armed only with daggers, targeting the strongest and most rebellious helots. Some victims were stabbed in their sleep. Others were dragged into the woods, where their bodies were left as gruesome warnings. Historians like Plutarch describe entire villages waking to find corpses dangling from trees, a deliberate spectacle designed to crush hope before it could spark revolt. What made the crypteia especially terrifying was its randomness. Unlike wartime killings, these murders followed no schedule, obeyed no rules. A helot might survive a decade of backbreaking labor, only to have his throat slit by a 16-year-old seeking to prove his worth. The Spartans called it training, but in truth it was psychological warfare, a way to keep the helot population paralyzed by fear, their spirits broken long before their bodies failed. Even more disturbing was the ritualistic nature of the bloodshed. Before being inducted into the crypteia, boys underwent a perverse ceremony where they bathed in the blood of a sacrificed wolf, symbolizing their transformation from students to predators. Their first kills were often commemorated with feasts where elders praised their discipline while ignoring the trembling hands of those who'd just taken a life for sport. Some accounts suggest the boys weren't just rewarded for kills but for creativity. The more gruesome the method, the higher the honor. The crypteia's legacy isn't just one of brutality, but of systemic terror institutionalized by a society that worshipped strength above all else. Modern parallels, from death squads to gang initiations, pale in comparison, because Sparta's killing machine was state-sanctioned, celebrated, and woven into the fabric of so-called civilization. Those marble statues of Spartan heroes, they were paid for in the blood of the invisible, murdered under cover of darkness by boys who learned too young that to be a god of war, you first had to become a monster. Athenian democracy is often hailed as the birthplace of political freedom, a shining beacon where citizens could shape their own destinies through debate and vote. But peel back the golden veneer and you'll find a system built on exclusion, where the very definition of citizen was a privilege reserved for a select few. Only freeborn Athenian men over 18 could participate. Women were confined to the shadows of their homes. Slaves outnumbered their masters 3-1 yet had no rights at all. And foreigners, even those living in Athens for generations, were dismissed as metics, perpetual outsiders. This wasn't democracy as we understand it today. It was an exclusive club where power was concentrated in the hands of a tiny fraction of the population while the rest were silenced. Then there was ostracism, a practice that turned democracy into a weapon of mass ruin. Once a year, citizens could scratch a name onto pottery shards, ostraca, and if any person received enough votes, they'd be exiled for a decade. No trial, no evidence, just the whims of the crowd. Ostracism was meant to prevent tyranny, but it often became a tool for petty vengeance or political sabotage. Take the case of Aristides, a general so respected he was called the Just. After a rival spread rumors that he was growing too powerful, the vote went against him. Legend claims an illiterate voter, not recognizing Aristides, asked him to write his own name on the shard. Without hesitation, Aristides complied, sealing his own fate. The system's brutality wasn't just in who it excluded, but in how it manipulated those it included. Politicians like Cleon rose to power by pandering to the masses, whipping up public hysteria to banish rivals or fund reckless wars. Meanwhile, women like Aspasia, a brilliant philosopher and partner to Pericles, were barred from speaking in the assembly, their influence forced to operate in whispers behind closed doors. Even Socrates, despite his fame, fell victim to democracy's darker impulses, condemned to death by a jury swayed more by emotion than reason. What makes Athenian democracy so unsettling isn't just its flaws, but how closely they mirror modern struggles. We idolize their ideals while ignoring that their system thrived on the backs of the marginalized, that their vaunted freedoms were built on the silence of others. The next time someone invokes ancient Greece as a model for governance, remember, the cradle of democracy was also a place where the will of the people could destroy lives as easily as it celebrated them. The symposium, a word that conjures images of bearded philosophers sipping wine while debating truth and beauty, was in reality a powder keg of exploitation, betrayal, and brutality. These all-male drinking parties, held in private homes after sunset, followed strict rituals, but beneath the veneer of sophistication lurked a world where slaves were treated as living furniture. Political coups were whispered between cups of undiluted wine, and a single insult could end in bloodshed. Take the kylix, the shallow wine cup designed for reclining guests. Its cheerful scenes of Dionysian revelry hid a sinister practicality. The wide rim made it easy to drug a rival's drink. Historians recount how Alcibiades, the golden boy of Athens, once spiked an entire symposium's wine to humiliate his enemies, leaving them vomiting in the streets while he stole state secrets from their unconscious bodies. Meanwhile, the hetairai, educated female companions brought in for entertainment, walked a razor's edge. Though some gained influence like Aspasia, most were slaves forced to perform erotic dances or endure groping hands under the pretense of cultured companionship. Violence simmered just beneath the surface. Drinking games weren't mere trivia, they were tests of loyalty. A guest refusing to drain his cup might be accused of plotting with Sparta. Worse were the katabos competitions, where men flung wine dregs at bronze targets. What started as sport often devolved into brawls when drunken aim accidentally soaked a rival's robes, a deadly insult in status-obsessed Athens. One vase painting shows a symposium gone wrong. a guest strangles another over a gambling debt while slaves scurry to mop up blood mixing with spilled wine. The darkest secret, these weren't exceptions. Xenophon describes a symposium where the host, for amusement, forced a slave boy to strip and dance on broken pottery until his feet were ribbons of flesh. No one protested because in that room, surrounded by poetry and perfumed oil, the line between civilized men and monsters was as thin as the glaze on their cups. The next time you romanticize these gatherings as intellectual salons, remember, they were theaters of cruelty where the only truth debated was how far power could bend humanity before it broke. In 2014, archaeologists in Amphipolis made a spine-chilling discovery, a tomb so vast, so intricate, that it could only belong to someone of legendary status. Hidden beneath a mound nearly 500 feet in diameter, its entrance guarded by colossal marble sphinxes, lay a burial chamber unlike any found in Greece for over a century. As researchers ventured deeper, they uncovered a series of sealed rooms adorned with stunning mosaics, including one depicting Hades abducting Persephone, a haunting motif that set the tone for what awaited inside. Then came the bones, a skeleton, likely female, surrounded by scattered remains of another individual, their identities shrouded in mystery. Whispers spread like wildfire. Was this the lost tomb of Olympias, Alexander the Great's notoriously ruthless mother, or Roxana, his ill-fated wife, murdered alongside their son in the political chaos following his death? But it wasn't just the scale of the tomb that sent shivers down spines. It was the unsettling string of events that followed its opening. Locals began circulating stories of a curse, pointing to the sudden death of lead archaeologist Katerina Peristri's assistant mere months after the excavation began. Others claimed equipment malfunctioned inexplicably, that cameras captured ghostly shadows flitting between the tomb's pillars. Whether superstition or strange coincidence, the tales echoed ancient Macedonian beliefs that disturbing the dead invited divine retribution. Even the tomb's design seemed to warn intruders. Its labyrinthine corridors and false doorways evoked Egyptian burial practices meant to trap grave robbers for eternity. The most tantalizing and terrifying clue lay in the skeletal remains. Forensic analysis revealed the primary occupant had died violently, her bones bearing marks consistent with a brutal execution. For historians, this was a grim puzzle piece. Olympias was known to have been stoned to death by relatives of those she'd slaughtered in her quest for power. Roxana, meanwhile, was starved in a dungeon by Alexander's successors. Either scenario would explain the tomb's hidden location, a last-ditch effort to protect these reviled women from desecration by their enemies. Yet the tomb guards its secrets fiercely. Despite years of study, no inscription confirms its occupant, and the Greek government has tightly controlled access to the site, fueling speculation of a cover-up. Whether cursed or simply misunderstood, Amphipolis remains a haunting reminder of how close glory and ghastliness walked in the ancient world. The next time you marvel at Alexander's conquests, remember, even in death, his family's legacy is written not in gold but in whispers of blood and vengeance. In the year 415, as the sun blazed over Alexandria, a mob of Christian zealots dragged Hypatia, the greatest philosopher of her age, through the streets like a slaughtered animal. Her crime, possessing a mind sharper than the blades that would soon flay her alive. The daughter of the mathematician Theon, Hypatia had shattered every expectation of her time, a woman who lectured on astronomy, geometry, and Plato's philosophy to packed halls of male students, her brilliance so renowned that senators sought her counsel. But in an empire increasingly torn between reason and religious fervor, her very existence became a provocation. The attack was orchestrated by Cyril, Alexandria's newly minted bishop, who saw Hypatia's influence as a direct threat to his authority. Whispers spread that she practiced sorcery, code for the forbidden act of thinking freely. When a gang of Parabolani, Cyril's militant followers, ambushed her chariot, they didn't just kill her. They stripped her naked, scraped her flesh clean with oyster shells, a grotesque parody of purification, then burned what remained in a pyre of mathematical scrolls. The message was clear: knowledge itself was heresy now. What makes Hypatia's murder so chilling isn't just its brutality, but how swiftly it was sanitized by history. Christian chroniclers like Socrates Scholasticus spun the lynching as a regrettable excess, while others blamed Hypatia for meddling in men's affairs. Even her famed tolerance became a weapon against her. She taught pagan and Christian students alike, proving unity was possible, precisely why fanatics needed her gone. Archaeologists recently unearthed fragments of the very lecture hall where Hypatia once stood. Buried beneath the modern city, its charred floor tiles tell a silent story of what happens when ideology extinguishes curiosity. The next time someone claims the ancient world revered wisdom, remember Hypatia the thinker whose legacy wasn't just erased but literally scraped from the bones of history. Long before Rome's infamous crackdown on the Bacchanalia, Dionysian cults in Greece were already dancing on the knife's edge between worship and madness. While Roman historians painted their own Bacchus worshippers as depraved criminals, the Greek origins of these rites were far darker, steeped in a tradition where ecstasy and violence weren't just tolerated but sanctified. Take the Agrionia festival in Boeotia. Women, supposedly possessed by Dionysus, would hunt down male cult members in a ritual reenactment of the god's mythic dismemberment. The catch: some of these pretend chases ended with real bloodshed. Plutarch records a chilling account from Orchomenos, where one year the frenzied women cornered a king's son and tore him limb from limb like the mythical Pentheus. The town buried the scandal by banning the festival forever, but whispers lingered that similar rituals still thrived in mountain villages where no Roman magistrate dared to venture. The Roman Senate's purge of the Bacchanalia in 186 BC wasn't just moral panic, it was a terrified response to something far older and wilder than they understood. Greek cults had perfected the art of divine frenzy centuries earlier, weaving it into the fabric of rural life. In places like Mount Cithaeron, initiates called Bacchoi would vanish into the wilderness for days, returning with stories of communing with spirits, and sometimes with wounds that couldn't be explained by mere ritual. One Athenian courtroom speech survives, accusing a Dionysian priest of leading a child to their death during a nighttime rite. The boy's body found tangled in ivy with a smile frozen on his lips. The defense: that the child had been taken by the god. The jury acquitted, too afraid of Dionysus' wrath to convict. What made the Greek versions of these cults even more dangerous than their Roman imitations was their deep roots in local power structures. In Thebes, Dionysus was worshipped as a founding deity, his Maenad priestesses holding political sway. When the Romans later unearthed scrolls detailing supposed Bacchanalia crimes, orgies, poisonings, forged wills, they were likely reading watered-down echoes of authentic Greek practices. A vase from 5th century Corinth shows a reveler straddling a bleeding goat, his face contorted in ecstasy as another participant brandishes a knife. The inscription reads "Sparagmos," the sacred act of tearing flesh. This wasn't secret rebellion, it was state-sanctioned spirituality at its most visceral. The ultimate irony: Rome's ban only drove the cults deeper underground, where they festered into something even the Greeks might have found excessive. By the time Christianity rose, Dionysus had been recast as Satan by fearful preachers, but the true horror lay in realizing how thin the line had always been between God and monster, between worship and butchery. The next time you see a grapevine twisting in the wind, remember, its roots reach down into an age when madness wasn't a metaphor but a sacrament written in blood. The myth of the Minotaur, a monstrous half-man, half-bull lurking in a labyrinth, devouring sacrificed youths, feels like pure fantasy. But beneath the legend lies a truth far more unsettling, rooted in the very real and deadly rituals of Bronze Age Crete. The island's Minoan civilization worshipped bulls with a reverence that bordered on obsession. and their so-called bull-leaping ceremonies were anything but ceremonial. Frescoes in Knossos depict acrobats somersaulting over charging bulls, their grace belying the danger. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons of young men with ribs crushed inward, pelvis bones shattered, spines twisted at impossible angles, casualties of a sport that was less performance and more ritualized Russian roulette with a one-ton beast. This wasn't entertainment, it was a test of divine favor where failure meant being gored on curved horns or trampled under hooves. The bull leapers, often teenagers, trained for years, but no skill could guarantee survival when facing an animal bred for aggression. Some scholars believe the Minotaur itself was born from these grisly spectacles, a metaphorical monster representing the ever-present threat of death in the ring. The famous labyrinth, it might not have been a maze at all, but the sprawling, windowless corridors of Knossos Palace where political prisoners were held in darkness. Greek invaders encountering these ruins centuries later could have spun tales of a beast in a labyrinth to explain the eerie frescoes of bull leapers and the bones buried beneath the stones. Even the sacrificial aspect of the myth checks out. Crete's dominance over Athens wasn't just political, it was economic. The demand for Athenian youths as tribute might reflect a darker reality, Crete's need for fresh bodies to feed its deadly cult of the bull. The legend claims 14 youths were sent annually, but Minoan records hint at far higher numbers. One clay tablet lists 32 for the horns, a chilling inventory that could mean anything from slaves to victims. The Minotaur's true horror isn't the monster, but the system that created it. Every civilization has its sacrifices dressed up as tradition, its brutal truths hidden behind myth. Crete's labyrinth wasn't just a prison, it was a mirror, reflecting how easily reverence can twist into cruelty when power demands blood. The invasion should have been unstoppable. In 480 BC, the Persian king Xerxes sent his army toward Delphi, home of Greece's most sacred oracle, intent on plundering its treasures and silencing Apollo's voice forever. But according to Herodotus, something inexplicable happened. As the Persians neared the temple, the earth itself seemed to revolt. Rocks tore loose from Mount Parnassus, crushing soldiers in a landslide the defenders swore was hurled by the gods. Then came the phantoms, towering, armored figures materializing from the mist, their swords flashing as they cut down invaders where no living warrior stood. By dawn, the Persians fled in disarray, convinced they'd faced Apollo's wrath in the flesh. Modern historians, however, suspect a far more sinister force was at work, one hidden in Delphi's very foundations. The temple sat atop the Castalian spring, a water source later found to contain high levels of ethylene, the same hallucinogenic gas that fueled the Pythia's visions. Could entire armies have fallen victim to mass delirium? Accounts describe Persian troops drinking from local streams before the battle, their minds flooding with visions of spectral foes. Even the landslide fits ethylene exposure causes vertigo and disorientation, making panicked soldiers mistake a natural rockslide for divine artillery. The clincher, Delphi's priests were notorious for manipulating perceptions. They'd lace sacrificial smoke with narcotics to enhance prophecies, and their control over the Castalian spring's flow suggests they could have poisoned enemy water supplies. When Herodotus writes of Persian scouts seeing 2 hoplites taller than men guarding the temple path, it echoes symptoms of ethylene poisoning, distorted depth perception, macropsia, seeing objects as larger than life, and paranoia. Perhaps the greatest trick Delphi ever pulled was convincing history that ghosts saved them. The next time you hear of miracles on ancient battlefields, remember, sometimes the deadliest weapons aren't swords but the chemistry of fear itself. The death of Socrates isn't just a tragic footnote in philosophy, it was a calculated political murder, a warning shot fired by a broken democracy desperate to reclaim control. Picture Athens in 399 BC, a city still reeling from its humiliating defeat to Sparta. The streets buzzed with paranoia, Former heroes were now scapegoats, and suspicion clung to anyone who dared question the fragile new order. Enter Socrates, the notorious gadfly, whose habit of interrogating Athens' most powerful men didn't just annoy the elite, it exposed the rot at the core of their rebuilding society. His trial wasn't about corrupting the youth or disbelieving the gods. It was about silencing a man who'd spent decades proving how little those in power actually knew. The charges against him were laughably vague, a telltale sign of their true purpose. Meletus, Anytus, and likened the three citizens who brought the case weren't philosophers. They were political operatives. Anytus, a wealthy tanner, had personal beef. Socrates had openly mocked his son's education. But the deeper threat was Socrates' ties to the 30 tyrants, the brutal Spartan-backed regime that had briefly overthrown democracy. Among their ranks, Critias and Charmides, two of Socrates' most infamous students. Never mind that Socrates had refused their orders to arrest an innocent man during their reign. Guilt by association was enough for a jury stacked with men who'd survived purges. The trial itself was a masterclass in manipulation. Without lawyers or evidence, Athenian trials relied on emotional appeals. Prosecutors painted Socrates as a walking contradiction, a thinker who praised Spartan discipline while living in filthy poverty, a man who claimed ignorance yet attracted Athens' brightest minds. The jury, 500 strong, included everyone from illiterate farmers to bitter aristocrats. When the vote came, it wasn't close, 280 to convict, 220 to acquit. Then came the real shock. Instead of proposing exile or a fine, Socrates, ever the provocateur, suggested the city reward him with free meals for life. The jury's second vote was even harsher. Death by hemlock was now inevitable, but here's what most retellings miss. The trial wasn't the end game. It was meant to scare him into fleeing. Athenian elites expected Socrates to accept exile, as so many had before him. His refusal to run wasn't just bravery, it was defiance. By drinking the hemlock willingly, he turned his execution into a spectacle, forcing Athens to confront its own hypocrisy. Even in death, he was teaching. As the poison crept through his veins, his final words, "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius," or were a cryptic jab. Asclepius was the god of healing. Was Socrates implying Athens needed curing from its own delusions? The aftermath proved his point. Within years, the men who'd condemned him fell from grace. Anytus was exiled for treason. Meletus was lynched by an angry mob, and Athens, shamed by its own actions, erected a statue in Socrates' honor. His students from Plato to Xenophon immortalized him not as a martyr, but as a mirror, one that reflected how quickly fear could turn a democracy into a mob. The next time someone calls Socrates a saint of free thought, remember, his true legacy isn't how he died, but how he exposed the system that killed him. At the crossroads of ancient Greece, where three paths met under a moonless sky, something far darker than mere superstition lurked, a cult so terrifying even the bravest souls avoided speaking its name aloud. This was the domain of Hecate, the triple-faced goddess of magic, ghosts, and the underworld. Unlike the polished deities of Olympus, Hecate thrived in the shadows, her followers conducting rituals that blurred the line between devotion and absolute horror. Her worshippers didn't gather in sunlit temples but at liminal spaces, crossroads, graveyards, and cave entrances, where the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest. The rituals began at midnight when practitioners would dig pits called necromanteon, filling them with the blood of black dogs, snakes, or, according to some fragmentary inscriptions, that which walks on two legs. Ancient sources like the Greek magical papyri describe sacrifices so ghastly that even Roman authors, no strangers to brutality, referred to them only in veiled terms. A 1st-century curse tablet found in Athens bears the chilling line, "As this rooster's blood spills, so too shall the victims by Hecate's will." Was it metaphor or something far more literal? The darkest whispers surrounded Hecate's supposed power over the dead. Followers believed they could summon spirits to divine the future or curse their enemies, a practice called necromantia. Pausanias wrote of a sanctuary in Epirus where petitioners would descend into an underground labyrinth, surviving on hallucinogenic barley cakes until the boundary between worlds dissolved before them. Some never returned. Those who did spoke of voices in the dark, of skeletal hands brushing their skin, of revelations that drove men mad. What makes Hecate's cult uniquely disturbing is its persistence. While other mystery religions faded, hers endured, morphing into medieval witchcraft. The very symbols used in her rites, the dagger, the cauldron, the hanged effigy, became the hallmarks of later witch hunts. The next time you pass a shadowed crossroads at night, remember, you might be walking over a 2,000-year-old pit where someone once begged the goddess of ghosts for a favor no mortal should ever ask. The city of Epidamnus should have been prosperous, a bustling trading hub on the Illyrian coast where Greek colonists and local tribes mingled peacefully. But in the year 435 BC, something snapped. A simmering class war erupted into a nightmare of neighbor turning on neighbor, a frenzy of violence so vicious it became a blueprint for every civil war that followed. They called it stasis, not just conflict, but a societal sickness where loyalty meant nothing and brutality became the only language left. It began with a petty political dispute between the oligarchs and democrats, the wealthy elite clinging to power while the commoners demanded a voice. When a disputed election sparked riots, the oligarchs called in barbarian mercenaries to crush the protests. That was the first mistake. The mercenaries, seeing the city's wealth up close, decided to take it for themselves. Streets became battlegrounds, houses were turned into fortresses, and before long, Epidamnus was a free-for-all. The Democrats, now armed and desperate, didn't just overthrow the oligarchs, they hunted them. Men were dragged from their homes, their tongues cut out to silence their influence. Women and children, accused of harboring traitorous sympathies, were exiled barefoot into the mountains. The worst came after the fighting stopped. With no clear victor, paranoia festered. Former friends denounced each other to seize property. Trials became spectacles where guilt was decided by who shouted loudest. One account describes a man sentenced to death for stealing a loaf of bread, only for his accuser to be executed the next day when someone else fabricated evidence against him. The city's once thriving port decayed as trade partners fled the chaos. Even the gods seemed to abandon. Epidamnus temples were looted, sacred olive groves burned for fuel. What makes this slaughter stand out isn't the scale, but the intimacy. Athens and Sparta's wars had battle lines. Epidamnus had brothers strangling each other over disputed inheritances, mothers poisoning daughters-in-law to secure their sons' loyalties. The historian Thucydides, documenting the war's spread to Corcyra, wrote that words lost their meaning, reckless bravery became cowardice, moderation was weakness, and savagery was praised as intelligence. Epidamnus wasn't an anomaly, it was a warning. Across Greece, from Argos to Megara, the same patterns played out whenever democracy and oligarchy collided. The violence wasn't just about power. It was about identity, about people redefining who counted as one of us and who needed to be erased. The next time you think of Greek democracy as a noble experiment, remember Epidamnus, where the will of the people turned into a death warrant for anyone who disagreed. High in the cliffs of Cumae, an old woman crouched in her cave, scribbling fate on oak leaves that scattered in the wind before anyone could read them. This was the Sibyl, ancient Greece's most feared prophetess, a figure whose visions didn't just predict the future, but seemed to twist it into being. Unlike the oracle at Delphi, who spoke in riddles, the Sibyl's prophecies were blunt instruments of doom, cities burning, empires collapsing, plagues rising from the earth. And what made them truly dangerous wasn't their accuracy, but how eagerly the powerful weaponized them. Take the Sibylline books, a collection of apocalyptic verses smuggled into Rome during its early days. According to legend, the Cumean Sibyl offered 9 volumes of prophecies to King Tarquin, who refused to pay her exorbitant price. She burned 3, then offered the remaining 6 at the same cost. When he refused again, she burned 3 more. Desperate, Tarquin bought the final 3 only to discover they contained warnings so dire that Rome kept them under lock and key, consulted only in times of crisis. But here's the twist. Historians now suspect these ancient texts were frequently edited, with new calamities added whenever senators needed to justify unpopular wars or purge political rivals. A convenient plague prediction could dissolve public opposition to military action. A forecast of divine wrath might silence critics of a new tax. The Sibyl's greatest power lay in her ambiguity. Her prophecies were never dated, allowing rulers to retroactively claim events fulfilled them long after the fact. When Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii, officials dusted off century-old Sibylline verses about fire raining from the sky, insisting the disaster had been foretold, and more importantly, that only adherence to state religion could prevent the next one. Even her failures were spun as proof of her genius. After one prediction of Rome's fall failed to materialize, priests claimed it had been thwarted by their timely sacrifices. But the darkest secret, many Sibyls weren't solitary mystics but tools of the state. The oracle at Cumae was often a rotating cast of priestesses, their trances induced by hallucinogenic fumes piped into their cavern. Some accounts describe young girls chosen for their beauty, only to be abandoned decades later as witched old women, their voices hoarse from decades of screaming prophecies on command. Their visions didn't come from the gods, they came from the officials who fed them questions and cherry-picked answers. By the time Christianity rose, the Sibyls had become so ingrained in the public imagination that church fathers repurposed them, claiming their gloomiest predictions actually foretold Christ's coming. A 5th-century mosaic in Ravenna shows the Cumean Sibyl standing alongside Old Testament prophets, a pagan seer rebranded as a reluctant herald of the Christian God. The irony, even in co-option, the prophecies retained their power to manipulate. The next time someone claims to know the future, remember, the most dangerous predictions aren't the ones that come true, but the ones people believe enough to make true. The cliffs of Anthela echoed with screams not of battle, but of something far more chilling, the collective death cries of an entire people choosing oblivion over submission. In 352 BC, the Phocians, a small but fiercely independent tribe, found themselves cornered by the relentless forces of Philip II of Macedon. Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and with their sacred temple of Apollo already plundered, they faced a choice: surrender and endure slavery, or control the one thing left to them, the manner of their end. They chose fire. Ancient historians like Diodorus describe the scene with grim awe. As Macedonian soldiers scaled the cliffs expecting surrender, they were met not with raised swords but with silence. Then the smoke began. The Phocians had barricaded themselves inside their wooden fortifications and set their own world ablaze. Men, women, and children huddled together as flames licked at their homes, their bodies, their history. Those who hesitated were handed cups of poison mixed with wine. Others leapt into the inferno, clutching their children, preferring ash to chains. By the time Philip's men breached the walls, they found only charred bones and the sickening sweetness of burnt flesh, a victory so hollow it haunted the conquerors for years. What makes this mass suicide so unsettling isn't just the scale, but the precision. The Phocians didn't act in panicked desperation. They organized their annihilation like a final ritual. Elders distributed hemlock. Mothers sang lullabies to infants as they administered lethal doses. Warriors sharpened daggers not for the enemy but for their own throats. This was defiance polished to a grim art, a statement so visceral it transcended language. You can take our lives, but you will never own them. The parallels to later tragedies are impossible to ignore. Centuries later at Masada, Jewish rebels would choose death over Roman enslavement in an eerily similar stand. but the Phocian story lacks even that glimmer of heroic legend. No grand speeches survive, no last stand immortalized in art. Only fragments of pottery bearing their names, and the whispered accounts of Macedonian soldiers who, upon seeing the carnage, reportedly crossed themselves as if they'd witnessed something unholy. Perhaps the most haunting question isn't why they did it, but why we've nearly forgotten them. History celebrates martyrs who die for causes, but the Phocians died simply to deny their enemies the satisfaction of conquest. In a world that measures legacy by battles won and monuments built, their choice resists easy glorification. Their ashes scattered on the wind left no tombs to adorn, no spoils to loot, just a warning, carved not in stone but in the collective memory of what happens when a people decide that some fates are worse than death. At the edge of the known world, where the river Akron, the mythical gateway to Hades, emptied into the Ionian Sea, stood a ruin that still chills archaeologists to this core. This was the Necromanteon of Ephyra, a labyrinthine temple where the living dared to descend into the realm of the dead, seeking answers from ghosts who weren't always willing to speak. Unlike Delphi's sun-drenched oracle, this was a place of perpetual twilight where every whisper echoed with the weight of the underworld. The rituals began with days of preparation, fasting, bathing in icy waters, and ingesting a paste scholars now suspect contained hallucinogenic plants like henbane or datura. Then came the descent. Visitors were led through a maze of pitch-black corridors, their hands brushing against walls carved with eerie reliefs of demons and tormented souls. At the heart of the temple lay the Psychomanteon, a chamber built like an inverted womb, its center dominated by a bronze cauldron resting on a tripod, a direct homage to the one Hades used to boil the damned. Here, priests would sacrifice black sheep, letting their blood pool into trenches as fumes from burning narcotic herbs filled the air. What happened next was a masterclass in psychological terror. Ancient accounts describe visitors being locked inside the chamber for hours, their disoriented minds assaulted by hidden sound effects, groaning pipes simulating ghostly wails, hidden vents blasting cold air like the breath of specters. Some swore they saw full-bodied apparitions, others collapsed, convinced invisible hands were clawing at their flesh. The historian Herodotus recounts one nobleman's ordeal. After 3 nights in the chamber, he emerged screaming that his dead son had grabbed his ankles, begging to be taken back to the land of the living. The nobleman died within a week, his body covered in inexplicable bruises. But the most disturbing evidence comes from the temple's basement. Excavations revealed a network of hidden passages and rotating walls. Priests could appear and vanish like ghosts, their voices distorted by bronze tubes snaking through the walls. A stone slab dubbed the Gate to Hades concealed a pit filled with animal bones and shattered pottery, likely used to simulate the voices of the dead. Modern tests showed the chamber's acoustics could make whispers sound like they came from every direction at once, a phenomenon ancient worshippers would have interpreted as spirits swarming around them. What makes the Necromanteon uniquely sinister isn't just its theatrics, but its purpose. This wasn't about prophecy, it was about power. Wealthy patrons paid fortunes to contact deceased rivals, extracting fabricated confessions or secrets that priests could weaponize in political schemes. One inscription lists a payment from a Corinthian general to ask his fallen enemy where he'd hidden stolen gold, a request that conveniently led soldiers to dig up the man's innocent nephew as the thief. The temple's final horror, its influence outlived its ruins. Early Christian writers recycled its imagery for visions of hell, while Renaissance magicians copied its rituals verbatim. Even today, when horror films show seances with swirling mists and groaning spirits, they're unknowingly channeling the Necromanteon's 2,000-year-old bag of tricks. The next time you hear a ghost story, ask yourself, are you afraid of the dead or the living who have learned to mimic them? For all its marble-columned grandeur and philosophical brilliance, ancient Greece was a civilization built on contradictions, where democracy coexisted with slavery, where art flourished alongside unimaginable cruelty. The stories we've uncovered today reveal a world far darker than the sanitized versions taught in classrooms. This was a society that abandoned infants to die on lonely hillsides, that turned child rearing into a brutal culling process for Sparta's war machine, that masked political murder as divine justice. The same hands that sculpted the Venus de Milo also flayed slaves alive for minor mistakes. The minds that pioneered geometry and theater equally justified ritualized rape in the name of religion. What makes these revelations so unsettling isn't just their brutality, but how seamlessly they were woven into daily life. The Oracle of Delphi didn't just predict the future, she poisoned minds with hallucinogenic gases while priests laundered political agendas as divine will. The Olympic Games, now a symbol of unity, were once blood-soaked spectacles where death was part of the entertainment. Even Athens, the so-called cradle of democracy, functioned as an exclusive club where ostracism could ruin lives on a whim and philosophers drank hemlock for asking too many questions. This duality forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. No civilization is purely heroic or monstrous. The Greeks gave us foundational concepts of justice and reason while committing atrocities that would make modern warlords blanch. Their legacy isn't tarnished by these revelations, it's humanized, because history isn't a pedestal for glorification. It's a mirror showing how even the most enlightened societies grapple with their own capacity for darkness. So as we close this journey through Greece's hidden shadows, here's a question to ponder. If these revelations about such a well-documented civilization still surprise us, how much do we really know about other ancient cultures? The Mayans, the Egyptians, the Vikings, how many of their darkest chapters remain buried under centuries of myth and selective storytelling? The past never stops whispering its secrets, but we have to be willing to listen even when the truth disturbs our cherished narratives. If this glimpse into antiquity's complexities intrigued you, hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten histories. And drop a comment below. Which civilization's dark side should we explore next? The answers might just rewrite everything we thought we knew.